Hi everyone, my name is Anna Collard and I'm going to talk to you about the myth of multitasking today. Or in other words, how multitasking can really be dangerous for us when we navigate online spaces. But before I start, I'd like to share a story of something that happened to me personally about a year ago. Now imagine sitting in an Uber car. This is in Cape Town, not the best area of town, where I was looking outside the windows. I was also speaking to the driver. I was packing my rucksack and checking my emails at the same time. Very bad idea, because in that exact moment I received this particular Uber phishing email. Luckily, this was just a phishing test that gets sent out by our security department. And if I saw this email at my desk, I wouldn't, given it two thoughts. It's obviously a phishing email. It uses a low-grade form of fear and some pressure to try and trick me into updating my account details. But in that moment, I actually clicked on it. And then as a consequence or punishment, however you want to look at it, I had to take a training program that I've developed myself a couple of years ago. So it wasn't the lack of training that made me click on this phishing email. There was something else at play. And what was interesting is that our IT department sent out a survey asking me, where was I? What was I doing? And I thought, this is really interesting because hypothetically, my colleagues, like me, we work for a security company. We really shouldn't be clicking on these phishing tests, but we do. And in about half of the cases, or 53%, of my colleagues that fail these tests do so not because they're not trained, they do so because they're busy multitasking and distracted. And this is not just the case at KnowBe4. This is actually a global phenomena that when people fall for phishing scams, they do so in about half of the cases because we're distracted or multitasking. And if we look at a human brain, there's three main area that unfortunately make us vulnerable to social engineering attacks or cyber criminals. And the first one is what I've mentioned already. It's the multitasking reality. The second one is that we spend about 80% of our time in what's called the System 1 or heuristic thinking mode. Now that's our brain taking shortcuts to conserve energy. And most of the time that's a good thing, but sometimes it means that we make wrong decisions, like I did in that case where my brain told me, oh, you're in an Uber car, you're receiving an Uber email, must be legit. And then thirdly, we may think we have evolved as a species, but we still very much react to threats, even if they're just virtual threats, like we used to when we were exposed to a physical threat in the savannah. So what happens, particularly when our fear response gets triggered, is that we may not respond in the most rational or appropriate way. And those three realities make us human, but they also unfortunately make us sometimes take the wrong decisions. We may not concentrate as much as we should and result in human error. And all of that by itself, again, makes us vulnerable or susceptible to social engineering attacks. And if we look at multitasking in particular, there's this wrong assumption that in today's world we can multitask. And unfortunately, that is not true. Yes, you can walk and talk at the same time, but when it comes to cognitive taxing tasks, we don't do two tasks at the same time. Rather, we switch between tasks very quickly. But every time we switch, there's a cost involved. And what that means is that our brains actually use up glucose or energy when we do that. And that explains why at the end of a day where you've done a lot of multitasking or switching, you feel depleted and exhausted from that process. And this can unfortunately really impact our cognitive and physical performances, and in the long run can have negative impact on long-term and working memory abilities. And that also explains why sometimes at the end of a day, and I'm definitely one of those people, you feel like you've done a lot, but we actually haven't achieved anything. So we sometimes confuse activity with productivity. And unfortunately, this whole process, because we become so habituated to it, has an addictive component to it. And what happens is that when you get distracted, let's say by a WhatsApp message, your built-in reward system, dopamine, is driving you to look at that, because dopamine just loves anything that's surprising. It wants to find out more. So what happens is you get distracted, you look at that message, let's say, and then by taking a decision to respond to this, you get another dopamine hit because you feel like you have actually ticked off something on your to-do list. And then that perpetuates this, what's called a dopamine feedback loop, and it ultimately ends up with people like myself again, looking or checking your phone without any notification being there in the first place. But it's becoming habitual and it's becoming addictive. And unfortunately, like with anything that's addictive, this again has very negative side effects to our mental health. So much so that in certain cases it can lead to anxiety and even depression. And because this reality of being human, it's not a technical problem. It's not something that we can patch with a new technology or a new update. Our operating systems haven't really been updated in hundreds of years. However, I can tell you that there is actually a patch for that, or something that we can do to make us more aware and present and less likely to fall victim. And that is called mindfulness. And the first thing to do is, particularly when it relates to multitasking, is to be aware of the fact that it is bad for us. To acknowledge that when we jump into a multitasking mode, that this will not only lead to possible vulnerabilities in terms of our cognitive processing, but it actually has a negative impact on our mental health and our overall performance. So the first thing we can do is to really be aware how bad multitasking is and try and prevent it at all costs. And we do that by proactively putting some rules in place. Like, for example, and obviously this depends on the type of work that you do, but if possible, particularly in the morning, assign focus time where you switch off all notifications, you switch off your phone if possible, and you just focus on the task at hand. And then in between, you go back to your email and your other text-based communication channels, and then you chunk that. So rather than being distracted by a message or an email one at a time, you switch it off and then you go back to it maybe 3-4 times a day, and you chunk it in 20-minute sort of chunks. And then you also time box it so that you don't spend more than those 20 minutes to respond to those emails. If there's something that requires more time, then you schedule it into a focused time block. And what's also important is when you work in these focused single task time blocks is that you build in breaks. And you can use the Pomodoro technique, where you work for, let's say, for 25 to 40 minutes at a time, and then you get up for 5 minutes and take a breather. The second thing we should do is stop multitasking by applying mindfulness. And mindfulness is really a term that stands for experiencing the present moment without judging it and without reacting to it. So rather observing what's happening before you react. And it's because of that mindfulness has also been termed an attentional control and distraction preventer, which I think is really fitting when we talk about preventing multitasking. And what that means in practical terms is that when you become aware, and this could be an internal as well as an external impulse. So when you become aware of an impulse that pulls you towards wanting to check your phone, for example, to not just do it, but rather be aware of that impulse. And then observe your reaction. You might have a FOMO response or anxiety or something that wants you to drive that, and to remember this is dopamine at play, or possibly even an addictive component of this dopamine feedback loop. And then rather than reacting to it, just take that pause and then intentionally deciding whether you want to give in to the impulse or maybe not. Maybe you can leave it for later. And that's literally mindfulness, is to silencing these noises, and those can be internally as well as externally created, and then becoming aware of them and then making your reaction more intentional. And one way of doing that, or doing it in a more practical manner, is by using something that we all have. It's a built-in superpower. It's the cheapest superpower tool that we have access to, and it's our breath. And literally just by inhaling through your nose into your belly and then making your exhale slightly longer than your inhale. So you could, for example, count to 4 on an inhale and then count to 6 or 8 on an exhale. And if you do this 3 times, you will calm down your nervous system. You will in fact activate your rest and digest, or your parasympathetic nervous system, and that will put you in a calmer state. It will break that addictive cycle that wants you to, let's say, check the phone or whatever it is, and it will help you to make a more intentional choice in that moment. And ultimately the goal should really be to focus on one task or one moment at a time, and to do it as slowly as possible. And as ironic as this sounds, it actually means that you will get so much more done at the end of the day, rather than rushing through many different parallel things. And that is why in the US military they apply this principle of slow is smooth and smooth as fast, because ultimately we'll get to the finishing line so much better and quicker and more effective if we're able to single task and do it slowly. So social engineers tap into our humanness and our psychological vulnerabilities. Multitasking is one of those vulnerabilities that we have, but we can use mindfulness as a technique to help us to be more focused, actually more productive, happier, and ultimately also safer. Thank you so much for listening. You're always welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn or email, and have a wonderful day. Bye.